There's something oddly romantic about risk when you're watching it from a distance. War feels like strategy instead of chaos. Adventure feels like purpose instead of desperation. And movies, especially from a year like 1965, sell that illusion beautifully. They package danger into something digestible, heroes into something believable, and failure into something poetic. But here's the thing. Time doesn't just age films, it exposes them. What once felt gripping can start to feel staged. What once looked heroic can feel quietly reckless. And what once made audiences lean forward, now sometimes makes us lean back. Because now we see the cracks. We notice the performances, the pacing, the choices that felt bold back then, but calculated today. And that's exactly why revisiting these films isn't just nostalgia, it's an autopsy of how cinema used to think. I'm James. Welcome to Vintage Time. Battle of the Bulge, 1965. If there's one word that defines Battle of the Bulge, it's ambition. Not subtle ambition. Not restrained ambition. The kind of ambition that tries to reconstruct an entire historical moment on a cinematic scale and hopes the audience doesn't notice the strain underneath it. Back in 1965, this was marketed as the ultimate World War II epic. Tanks, armies, strategy, betrayal, everything was meant to feel massive. And for audiences at the time, it delivered exactly that, spectacle. The sense that you were watching history recreated with as much force as the studio system could possibly muster. And visually? It still has weight. But here's the problem. Scale doesn't automatically create tension. Let's be honest. The film is constantly trying to balance narrative clarity with historical scope, and in doing so, it often sacrifices emotional focus. You're not always following characters, you're following movements, divisions, strategies. The war becomes a diagram more than a lived experience. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because modern audiences expect war films to anchor themselves in people, not just operations. We want to understand the fear behind decisions, not just the decisions themselves. But here, characters often feel secondary to the machinery of war. Even the villains, and yes, there's a clear antagonist structure, feel more like positions in a strategic puzzle than fully realized perspectives. And then there's the pacing. It's uneven in a way that reflects its ambition. Huge sequences of action are followed by long stretches of setup and repositioning. The rhythm doesn't always build, it resets. So instead of escalating tension, you get waves of it. Peaks and pauses. Impact and recalibration. That can work in theory. But emotionally, it creates distance. Still, there's no denying the film's technical effort. The scale of the battlefield sequences, the coordination of large set pieces, the attempt to capture winter warfare, it's all impressive in a very physical sense. You can see the production budget on screen. But from a modern perspective, it feels like a war film trying to prove how big war is, rather than how it feels to be inside it. And that distinction matters. Because Battle of the Bulge doesn't just show conflict. It tries to contain it. And war, as cinema has slowly learned, doesn't like being contained. The Flight of the Phoenix, 1965. There's a reason the Flight of the Phoenix still gets talked about whenever survival cinema is mentioned. It's not just about a plane crash in the desert, it's about what happens when logic, ego, and desperation collide under extreme pressure. Back in 1965, audiences saw it as pure tension cinema. A group of men stranded in the Sahara after a crash, slowly realizing that rescue isn't coming. The only option? Build a new aircraft from the wreckage of the old one. It sounds almost absurd when you say it out loud. But that's exactly why it worked. Because the film doesn't rely on action in the traditional sense. It relies on psychology. Who leads? Who follows? Who breaks first? The desert isn't just a backdrop, it's a pressure cooker stripping people down to their instincts. And for a long stretch, it's gripping. You can feel the frustration building. The arguments. The shifting authority. The quiet panic that no one fully admits out loud. It's survival storytelling at its most human. But here's the problem. The film's strength is also its limitation. Because once you understand the central idea, build or die, The narrative starts to repeat itself in cycles of planning, disagreement, and incremental progress. The tension is strong, but it doesn't always evolve. Let's be honest. A lot of the drama comes from personality clashes rather than external escalation. And while that can be effective, it also means the stakes sometimes feel static. The desert doesn't change. The threat doesn't expand. It just persists. That's where it starts to feel constrained. Even the characters, while well acted, tend to function within fixed emotional roles. The optimist, the skeptic, the authority figure. They rarely shift beyond those boundaries in meaningful ways. From a modern perspective, that predictability stands out more. Today's survival films tend to push transformation, how isolation changes people over time. Here, the transformation is subtler, almost understated. There's something deeply satisfying about the central construction sequence. Watching something seemingly impossible slowly take shape out of wreckage carries a strange emotional weight. It's not just engineering, it's hope taking form under pressure. And that's why the film endures. Because even if it doesn't always surprise you, it understands something fundamental about survival. It's not about escape. It's about refusing to accept that there is no escape. Ship of Fools, 1965. At first glance, Ship of Fools feels like one of those grand, ensemble dramas that classic Hollywood loved to produce. Big cast, big themes, and a setting that practically begs for metaphor. A ship traveling from Mexico to Germany in the 1930s, carrying passengers from different walks of life. Different beliefs. Different moral compasses. Back then, audiences saw it as profound. A moving reflection of a world on the brink. A story about humanity drifting, literally and figuratively, towards something dark. And to be fair, the ambition is undeniable. But here's the problem. Ambition doesn't always translate into impact. Watching Ship of Fools today feels a bit like reading a novel where every character represents an idea instead of a person. You can see what the film is trying to say, about prejudice, about denial, about the slow creep of fascism, but the delivery feels heavy, almost too deliberate. The characters don't always speak like people. They speak like arguments. Like the film is less interested in who they are, and more interested in what they symbolize. And that creates distance. Because instead of getting lost in their stories, you start analyzing them, breaking them down, watching the film instead of feeling it. That's where it starts to fall apart. The pacing doesn't help either. It moves slowly, not in a reflective way, but in a way that tests your engagement. Scenes linger, conversations stretch, and the emotional payoff doesn't always justify the time invested. Now compare that to modern ensemble films. Today, even when a movie tackles big themes, it usually grounds them in character-driven storytelling. It makes you care first and think later. Ship of Fools does the opposite. It asks you to think first, and caring becomes optional. But that doesn't mean it's without value. In fact, what's fascinating about the film is how openly it confronts uncomfortable truths. It doesn't hide its message. It doesn't soften its edges. It shows a world where people see what's coming and choose to ignore it. And that's unsettling in a way that still resonates. From a modern perspective, it can feel overly theatrical, overwritten, even a little exhausting. But maybe that's part of its identity. Because Ship of Fools isn't trying to entertain you. It's trying to warn you. And sometimes, warnings aren't meant to be subtle. The Cincinnati Kid, 1965. There was a time when The Cincinnati Kid felt like the definitive poker film. The kind that didn't just show gambling, but elevated it into something mythic. Back in 1965, audiences didn't just watch this movie, they studied it. The tension at the table, the quiet stares, the ritual of the deal, it all felt sacred. And at the center of it was Steve McQueen, the embodiment of cool, playing a man chasing something bigger than money, respect. It worked because it wasn't loud. It wasn't flashy. It was controlled, calculated. The kind of storytelling that trusted silence more than spectacle. But here's the problem. That same restraint is also where the film starts to feel distant. Because now, when you watch The Cincinnati Kid, you start noticing how much of its tension relies on atmosphere instead of momentum. The pacing doesn't build, it lingers. Scenes stretch longer than they need to, as if the film is daring you to stay patient rather than pulling you in. And let's be honest, the characters, while iconic, aren't exactly deep. McQueen's Kid is more of a symbol than a fully realized person. He represents ambition, sure, but we rarely get beneath the surface. We're told he's driven, but we don't always feel the weight of that drive. Then there's the poker itself. At the time, it was gripping. Today, it can feel repetitive. The same rhythms, the same beats. Without the modern editing or cinematic techniques we're used to, the game doesn't escalate. It circles. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because modern audiences expect psychological stakes to evolve, not just exist. Compare it to something like Rounders, and suddenly the Cincinnati Kid feels less like a battle of minds, and more like a prolonged stare-down. But still, there's something undeniably compelling about it. The film captures a very specific kind of masculinity. Quiet, controlled, competitive in a way that doesn't need to shout. And in that sense, it becomes less about poker and more about identity. About proving yourself in a world where reputation is everything. From a modern perspective, it's slower, less dynamic, sometimes frustratingly restrained. But maybe that's the point. Because the Cincinnati Kid isn't about winning the game. It's about understanding what it costs to sit at the table. Those magnificent men in their flying machines, 1965. There was a time when spectacle didn't mean CGI, it meant logistics. Real machines, real stunts, real risk. And those magnificent men in their flying machines thrived on exactly that. Back in 1965, this film wasn't just entertainment, it was an event. A sprawling, comedic celebration of early aviation, packed with elaborate flying contraptions and a cast of international caricatures competing in a cross-country air race. Audiences loved it because it felt joyful, playful, almost innocent in its sense of wonder. The sky wasn't just a setting, it was the entire point. Watching those fragile, bizarre aircraft wobble through the air had a kind of magic that modern cinema, ironically, struggles to replicate. But here's the problem. That magic is almost entirely visual, and once you adjust to it, the rest of the film starts to feel thin. Because underneath the spectacle, there's not much weight holding things together. The characters are exaggerated to the point of parody. The humor leans heavily on stereotypes, national quirks turned into punchlines, and while that might have landed in the 60s, today it feels a bit too obvious. Too broad. And let's be honest, the pacing doesn't do it any favors. The film stretches itself across a runtime that feels longer than the journey it's depicting. Gags repeat. Situations echo each other. And what initially feels charming slowly turns into something predictable. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because modern audiences are used to escalation. If a joke works once, it needs to evolve the second time. But here, the film seems content to circle the same comedic beats, trusting the spectacle to carry it. And for a while it does. Those aerial sequences are still impressive, arguably the film's greatest strength. There's a tangible sense of danger in every takeoff and landing. You can feel the weight of the machines, the fragility of the moment. No green screen, no safety net. But from a modern perspective, that's also the only thing keeping the film afloat. Everything else, the characters, the narrative, the humor, feels stuck in a different era. A simpler one, yes, but also a less demanding one. Because today, we expect comedy to have layers, characters to have arcs. Even in something lighthearted, those magnificent men in their flying machines doesn't aim for that. It's content being a spectacle. And while that makes it historically fascinating, it also makes it emotionally distant. Because in the end, the film isn't really about the people. It's about the machines. Von Ryan's Express, 1965. War films in the 1960s had a certain formula, clear objectives, defined heroes, and a sense that no matter how dangerous things got, there was always a path forward. Von Ryan's Express fits neatly into that mold. A story about Allied prisoners escaping a German POW camp and hijacking a train to freedom. On paper, it's everything audiences loved. Tension, action, and a charismatic lead in Frank Sinatra. At the time it worked. The idea of turning a train into both a weapon and an escape route felt thrilling. The confined space created natural tension. The stakes were clear. Survival wasn't just a goal, it was a ticking clock. But here's the problem. The film plays it a little too safe for a story that should feel unpredictable. Because once the escape begins, the narrative falls into a rhythm that's surprisingly controlled. You expect chaos. You expect the kind of desperation that war films thrive on. But instead, everything feels calculated, almost rehearsed. And that takes away from the tension. Let's be honest. Frank Sinatra's performance is solid, but it leans heavily on his persona. He's less a desperate soldier and more a composed strategist. That might make him watchable, but it also makes the danger feel distant. You don't always believe he's at risk. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because in modern war films, vulnerability is everything. Characters break. They doubt. They react emotionally to the pressure around them. But here, there's a kind of emotional restraint that keeps the audience at arm's length. Even the supporting characters, while functional, rarely step beyond their roles. They serve the plot, but they don't always deepen it. And then there's the pacing. It's not slow, but it's steady in a way that feels predictable. The film moves from one obstacle to the next without much variation in tone. You start to anticipate the beats before they happen, and once that happens, tension fades. Now compare that to modern war thrillers. Today, unpredictability is key. The sense that anything can go wrong at any moment. That survival isn't guaranteed. Von Ryan's Express doesn't quite reach that level. But that doesn't mean it's ineffective. In fact, its strength lies in its clarity. The story is easy to follow. The stakes are always visible. And the concept, turning an escape into a moving battlefield, is still compelling. From a modern perspective, it feels more like a blueprint than a fully evolved experience. A film that knows what it wants to be, but doesn't push far enough to become something greater. Because Von Ryan's Express isn't chaotic. It's controlled. And in a story about escape, control might be the very thing holding it back. King Rat, 1965. There's a strange contradiction at the heart of King Rat. On the surface, it's a war film about survival inside a Japanese POW camp during World War II. But underneath that, it's really about something far more uncomfortable: how people adapt morally when the system collapses. Back in 1965, audiences saw it as gritty, even daring. It didn't glorify war. It showed it as stagnant, dirty, and psychologically corrosive. And at the center of it all was a character who shouldn't have been likable, but somehow is. A man who thrives in chaos by bending every rule around him. That alone made it stand out. Because here's the thing. Most war films of that era wanted heroes. King Rat gives you survivalists instead. And that shift is where the film initially feels powerful. The camp isn't just a setting, it's a microeconomy. Everything has value. Everything is negotiable. Morality becomes flexible, depending on hunger, desperation, and opportunity. It's clever, almost ahead of its time. But here's the problem. That idea is stronger than its execution. Because the film becomes so focused on its internal system, the trading, the bargaining, the psychological games, that it starts to lose emotional depth. You observe the camp more than you feel it. Let's be honest. The protagonist is fascinating in theory, but distant in practice. He's charismatic, yes, but also emotionally sealed off. And that creates a barrier. You understand his intelligence, but you don't always connect with his humanity. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because modern storytelling demands vulnerability. Even anti-heroes need cracks. Moments where the mask slips. But King Rat keeps its characters too controlled, too strategically written. They function like chess pieces rather than living people under pressure. And the pacing doesn't help either. The film lingers in conversations that feel repetitive. It circles the same power dynamics without escalating them in a satisfying way. Instead of building tension toward a breaking point, it maintains a steady psychological hum. From a modern perspective, that can feel restrained to the point of emotional distance. But there's still something undeniably compelling about it. Because King Rat doesn't try to comfort you. It doesn't sanitize survival. It suggests that in extreme conditions, morality doesn't disappear, it just gets traded. And that idea still lands. Just not as sharply as it should. Because the film understands its world perfectly, but struggles to make you feel trapped inside it. Major Dundee, 1965. There's something almost ironic about Major Dundee. A war film about control, made by a filmmaker who famously struggled with it. On the surface, it's a Civil War Western-adjacent military adventure about a Union officer leading a ragtag group of soldiers and prisoners into Mexico in pursuit of Apache warriors. It sounds like a clean, mythic frontier story. But nothing about this film is clean. Back in 1965, audiences saw ambition. A rugged, sprawling war epic with moral tension baked into every frame. Charlton Heston's Major Dundee is written like a man trying to hold together something that refuses to stay unified: his men, his mission, and his own authority. And for a while it works. Because the idea is strong. A fractured command structure. A mission that drifts further from clarity with every mile. A group of men who don't trust each other, forced into survival anyway. It's the kind of setup that should naturally escalate into chaos. But here's the problem. The film itself feels like it's fighting against its own potential. Let's be honest. Major Dundee is structurally uneven in a way that's hard to ignore. Scenes feel stitched together rather than flowing. Tonal shifts happen abruptly. One moment it's a disciplined military narrative, the next it's drifting into almost surreal frontier wandering. That lack of cohesion affects everything. Even the characters suffer from it. Dundee himself is compelling in concept. A commander obsessed with proving himself, but the writing doesn't always give him consistent emotional grounding. He shifts between strategic brilliance and impulsive stubbornness without enough connective tissue in between. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because modern audiences expect evolution, not fluctuation. The character can be complex, yes, but complexity still needs direction. Here, it often feels like contradiction without commentary. And then there's the pacing. It doesn't just slow down, it loses rhythm entirely at points. The journey across the landscape should feel like escalating pressure. Instead, it sometimes feels like detours in search of narrative focus. But here's the strange part. Even in its messiness, there's something undeniably fascinating about it. Because Major Dundee feels like a film on the edge of collapsing under its own ambition. And that makes it more interesting than polished war epics that play it safe. From a modern perspective, you can see the fingerprints of a much larger vision, one that maybe never fully made it to the screen. You can sense the tension between studio structure and creative chaos. Between what the film wanted to be and what it was allowed to become. And that tension becomes part of the viewing experience. Because Major Dundee isn't just about a mission across hostile territory. It feels like a mission inside the film itself, trying to stay together while everything around it pulls apart. And in a strange way, that might be its most honest quality. In Harm's Way, 1965. There's a particular kind of war film that doesn't rush to impress you. It doesn't open with chaos. It doesn't scream for attention. Instead, it settles in, slow, deliberate, almost patient, like it's testing whether you're willing to stay for the long haul. In Harm's Way is exactly that kind of film. When it released in 1965, audiences saw it as a prestige war epic. A John Wayne vehicle with scale, seriousness, and that unmistakable Hollywood confidence that came from believing war stories should feel important even when they're not actively explosive. And for a while, it really does feel important. Because the film isn't just about battles, it's about command. About men making decisions that ripple into catastrophe. About how distance from the front lines doesn't equal distance from consequence. That's the promise. But here's the problem. The film is more fascinated with authority than humanity. Let's be honest. John Wayne's character feels less like a person and more like a concept of leadership. Controlled. Stoic. Almost emotionally inaccessible. He doesn't evolve so much as he positions himself within events. And that creates a strange distance between the audience and the stakes. You understand what's happening. You respect the structure. but you don't always feel it. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because modern war cinema thrives on emotional proximity. You want to feel the confusion, the fear, the moral breakdown of individuals inside the machine of war. Here, everything is filtered through discipline. Even emotional moments feel restrained, almost carefully contained. And that containment extends to the pacing too. At times, In Harm's Way moves like it's afraid of urgency. Scenes stretch out, conversations carry a formal weight, and even moments of tension feel composed rather than chaotic. Now, that might be intentional, but intention doesn't always equal engagement. Because from a modern perspective, you start noticing what's missing: unpredictability, raw reaction, the sense that things could spiral at any moment. Instead, the film often feels like it's observing war through glass, clear, but slightly removed. But here's the interesting part. That detachment is also what gives the film its identity. Because In Harm's Way isn't trying to immerse you in chaos. It's trying to show the architecture behind it, the decisions before the consequences, the structure that holds everything in place until it breaks. And when it does focus on those breaking points, it lands harder than expected. Not because it surprises you, but because it's been so controlled up to that moment. So even if it feels emotionally restrained by today's standards, there's still a quiet strength in its discipline. It's a film about leadership that never raises its voice. And that, in itself, says something about how power was portrayed in its era. Operation Crossbow, 1965. There's a certain irony in ending this list with Operation Crossbow. Because on paper, it should feel like the most straightforward entry: spycraft, wartime intelligence, secret weapons programs, and the looming threat of V-weapon attacks during World War II. It has all the ingredients of a tight, high-stakes espionage thriller. But instead, it becomes something more complicated and a little more uneven than its premise suggests. Back in 1965, audiences were still deeply fascinated by World War II intelligence narratives. The idea that wars weren't just won on battlefields, but in hidden rooms, coded messages, and quiet decisions, felt almost revolutionary. Operation Crossbow leaned into that fascination heavily, presenting a fragmented story about Allied efforts to stop Nazi rocket development. And for a while it works. Because the concept is inherently cinematic: scientists under pressure, spies embedded behind enemy lines, and a race against time to prevent mass destruction. It's Cold War paranoia filtered through World War II history. It should be gripping from start to finish. But here's the problem. The film never fully commits to a single emotional or narrative anchor. Let's be honest. It plays more like a collection of espionage episodes stitched together than a fully unified story. One moment you're in a scientific discussion about rocket design. The next, you're in a spy infiltration sequence. Then suddenly, you're back in strategic briefing rooms. And while each segment has merit on its own, the transitions between them feel mechanical. That's where it starts to fall apart. Because modern audiences expect narrative continuity to carry emotional weight. Even in ensemble or multi-threaded war stories, there's usually a central human thread that grounds everything. Here, that thread is faint, almost intentionally so, but it leaves the film feeling slightly fragmented. Even the characters, while functional, don't always evolve in ways that deepen engagement. They serve the mission more than they serve the story. And that creates a viewing experience where you understand what's happening, but don't always feel invested in who it's happening to. And then there's the pacing. It's uneven in a way that reflects its ambition. The film is constantly shifting gears: intelligence briefing to sabotage mission to scientific exposition. Instead of building tension in a straight line, it moves in clusters of information. From a modern perspective, that can feel more like documentation than storytelling. But here's the interesting contradiction. That same structure gives it a certain authenticity. Because intelligence work is fragmented. It is procedural. It doesn't always follow emotional arcs. It follows information, timing, and opportunity. In that sense, Operation Crossbow might actually be more realistic than it is traditionally entertaining. Realism doesn't always translate to engagement. And that's the tension at the heart of the film. Because while it succeeds in capturing the machinery of wartime intelligence, it struggles to translate that machinery into emotional momentum. So you're left with something that feels important, but not always gripping. The film about stopping catastrophe that sometimes forgets to make the audience feel the urgency of it. And maybe that's the final takeaway from 1965 as a whole. These films weren't afraid of scale, of ideas, of ambition. But sometimes, in chasing the size of history, they lost the heartbeat inside it.